Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. I'm your host, Carl Trueman, professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania. And here, as always, with my good friend and co-host, the Reverend Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, which is a congregation of the Presbyterian Church in America. Good to see you, Todd.
Good to see you, Carl. Now, I do have a question for you, Carl.
Yeah.
As you were naming my church, you said Covenant Presbyterian. Now, is that just, is there something, because we're PCA, is that just a reflexive, it's like you almost don't want to say we're Presbyterian because I'm PCA. Is that what that is?
Well, I was going to say it was a congregation of the PCA, but I wanted people to know it was a Presbyterian congregation of the PCA because we know that a lot of PCA churches, you have to search long and hard on their websites to find anything Presbyterian or anything to do with their denomination. So
true. Yes. It is actually on our sign out at the street. So
it is fascinating to me how many Presbyterians are embarrassed about being Presbyterian, but I know that you're not one of them.
Absolutely not. I'm a convert to Presbyterianism, so I'm actually excied about it.
I helped convert you, I seem to remember.
Of course.
I know you don't want to give me any credit. But,
I'll give you credit. It's all right.
Well, it's great to have you all listening today. Great to be with my friend Todd, and it's great to have another friend on. We are delighted today to have the Reverend Chris Castaldo, who is the senior pastor of New Covenant Church, which is a church in Naperville. If you don't know where Naperville is, it's not far from Wheaton. So you're in the sort of Chicago suburbs kind of area. And Chris, I think I'm right in saying you are a convert from Roman Catholicism. And we want to talk to you today about a little book that's just come out, Why Do Protestants Convert, published by the Davenant Trust, that is looking at why it is that, I would say, a certain demographic strand of Protestants convert to Catholicism, just as we set the whole thing up. When I was a pastor, I would say that in my church, probably a quarter to a third of the church came from Roman Catholic backgrounds and were all by that point Protestant. But many of us, particularly operating in without wanting to sound, it's going to sound a bit elitist, but I don't mean to sound elitist. Those of us operating in more intellectual academic circles perhaps experience the opposite, that the flow is not so much from Catholicism to Protestantism as it is from Protestantism to Catholicism. So great to have you on the show, Chris.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
And okay, why do Protestants convert? In 30 seconds, give us an exhaustive answer.
It's like you said, it's a volatile issue. It's, think of Christmas dinner and you're talking with your family and some are Catholic and some are Protestant and you try your best to be a winsome witness, but it goes off the rails every year. So we're trying to shed light on this subject that is so often full of heat. And particularly, as you said, why are individuals leaving Protestantism for Roman Catholicism? So we look at that in terms of the psychological, theological, and sociological reasons for such religious migration.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you bring those various elements into it, because as someone who has had conversations with those who have converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, or in some cases Eastern Orthodoxy as well, very often my conversations with them, theology is not the first thing for them. It has oftentimes other issues that they will name first, like the historical rootedness or the reverence that they found or the beauty that they found in the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox traditions. And then only after that, they'll talk some about the theology. But very often in my conversations, it's some of those other issues that might have to do with sociology, in some cases psychology. In fact, I was speaking to member of our church just a few weeks ago who has a good friend who's just converted to Rome and was raised evangelical, but was raised in megachurch, broad evangelical, very unrooted, and he became deeply unsatisfied with it psychologically, you could say. And so much of his expressions on why he converted had to do with that, had to do with things that he felt were missing from his and unsatisfying things that I would agree with would be unsatisfying about the broadly evangelical, ahistorical lack of rootedness. And so this book, though it's rather small, I found quite helpful in addressing the psychological and sociological dimensions. What are you finding there? What have you found in terms of those dimensions?
There's an experience in which we look at our church and we see some shortcoming. Maybe the teaching is shallow, maybe it's overly politicized, whatever it is. And then we look across the Tiber and we see the rootedness, we see the liturgical texture, and we think, I want more of that. And part of our project is to help those individuals recognize that the Reformation tradition provides the resources to answer those questions and satisfies those needs. So we envision three types of readers. One would be the convert himself. The other would be a friend of a convert. Because so often you get myopia. You focus on that part of your church that's not quite right. And you don't do adequate reflection on the whole. And then the third, and maybe most interesting, is the Protestant pastor or church leader, to do some honest self-evaluation of what's happening in my church, in my ministry, that is unwittingly pushing people into a conversion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've pled with people to try a good, solid, historical, reformed church before they make the leap. And one of the things I've told potential converts is that, look, the reason why, the main reason why I've gone back and read church fathers from the first 3 and 4 centuries is because the reformers who I was reading, Calvin and others, directed me to them because they saw their project so much as one of retrieving the history of their church. And so there is this deep rootedness within Protestantism if you know where to go and look for it. Yeah. And
that it seems to me requires real courage and honesty, that sort of self-evaluation. I think, for example, the Fifth Lateran Council started in 1512, went to 1517, at the beginning of which you had the Cardinal Giles of Viterbo, who said, men must be changed by religion, not religion by men. Unfortunately, this was the pontificate of Julius II. The Pope who enjoyed the smell of gunpowder more than incense. And so the council met, but it didn't do very much. He didn't have an appetite for genuine reform. And then it ends, it sort of peters out in 1517. Now, isn't that interesting? Yeah. That may be a coincidence.
Wow.
And I've thought about that. And I just wonder if the Lord said, okay, if the institutional church is unable or unwilling to get its house in order, I know an Augustinian monk, and he's a little crazy, but he's faithful and he's courageous. Yeah. And it seems to me that's the kind of fortitude we need in this moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a fascinating conversation with a Roman Catholic friend recently where she was expressing concern that she knew, and she sort of operates in fairly rarefied literary sort of circles in New York. And she was expressing concern that the number of young people in her kind of circles who were converting to Catholicism. But her concern was odd. It was this. It was, they're not doing it because they think it's true. They're doing it because they think it provides them with a framework to think about morality, or it provides them with something to ground their conservative politics and conservative view of society. Now, that interested me in that there you have conversions that are generated in some sense by the crazy political climate in which we find ourselves, rather than by the transcendent truth of what's going on. Have you come across that much, Chris?
Well, in the section that deals with the psychological reasons, we talk about authority hunger, holiness deficit disorder, and then the so-called inner ring, which we get from Lewis. And the idea there is that we want to belong. We want to belong to a community that has some intellectual gravitas. So I have a member of my church who does a lot of work in DC. He's part of a think tank. And he was saying, it's just not cool to be an evangelical in DC. There's no category for it. You're associated with a certain political party and a certain candidate, and there it is. You become persona non grata. Whereas if you're a Catholic intellectual, you have a home. There's a recognition that that's legitimate. And so I think that's part of what's going on.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you find that, and another thing that I chat to young people at Grove who come from big box Bible churches, often where they've been well taught and loved and cared for. It's not, I don't want to criticize the kind of churches they come from, but they will have criticisms of the churches and the tradition they come from. And one of the problems I sometimes face is this, that I agree with the criticisms they're making. They're thinking of Rome because X, Y, and Z apply in their church back home. Have you found that to be this is where I sort of struggle, if you like, as a Protestant. So when I was like, yeah, I agree with you. Certain aspects of Protestantism are really rubbish. And you're putting your finger on something there. But I also want to say to them, just because the coffee shop down the road doesn't brew a decent cup of coffee, doesn't mean that you should move to South America because you've heard there's a good coffee shop down in South America. Do you find that as being something that's driving a lot of young people? I suppose it's a version of the grass is greener kind of arguments, which you alluded earlier on.
Yeah, I think aesthetics is part of it. I mean, so look at a Bishop Robert Barron treatment of the great tradition in his Catholicism series. He's in Europe, the great cathedrals. He's in front of the Pietà. It's breathtaking.
Yeah.
And then you go to your local evangelical Protestant church and you got a drum cage with cables, and you look at that and you think, wow, I'm missing out on something.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right, Carl. That's what it looks like.
Yeah.
It was almost revelatory to me when I entered the Reformed tradition. Kind of what I had hoped for, what I had kind of almost instinctively knew was lacking long before I was able to put a word on it, coming out of broadly evangelical mega church culture. And again, that's where I came to know Christ. I heard the gospel preached there, but like you said, there were a lot of things that left us famished, though, unfortunately. And I understand why people cast a gaze toward Rome in coming out of that tradition. But what grieves me is that, as you have said, and as it's clear in the book, the Protestant church has this great tradition that links us really solidly to a history that so many of us never knew existed. And so it behooves the Protestant church all the more, particularly those in the Reformed tradition that know this and hold this, to teach well. And that's one of the things we've been grappling with at the church I serve is really wanting to begin teaching our children these really basic levels and categories of theology and naming the history of it, so that when they're a bit older, they'll know that already. They'll have a training that orients them in the history of the church, so they won't feel like we've starved them for that. Where do you see that going on really well somewhere, Chris, in any particular denomination, or do you are you encouraged by anything that's going on out there in those terms?
That's a great question, Todd, because people like us, we talk about retrieval and Reformed Catholicity. But it was recently I asked that question, where do I actually see it happening, right? And I think there are very few places where it's occurring in a tangible way. In our church, we've tried in our liturgy, for example, to appropriate the insights from the century's call to worship.
Yep.
We want to have a time for confession in the service and a word of assurance from the gospel. We pray the Lord's Prayer. We affirm the creed. in my preaching, I do my best to introduce voices and events from church history that will provide a broader awareness of what God has been doing. I think of what Timothy George has said: the Holy Spirit has a history and it matters. And so, I think there are places, but I think we're at a point, frankly, in which it's still more theoretical than actual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've encouraged folks to do the very thing you've brought up, and anytime pastors you're able to do what Calvin and Luther did so much. I mean, when you read Calvin, for instance, you find all these quotes from the church fathers, which I knew so little about, a little bit from some church history classes I took in college, but beyond that, not much until I started reading Calvin, and he kind of drove me to the fathers. And so I try to incorporate references to, as you said, illustrations from the lives of some of these men. And the people I have in mind most of all when I'm searching for that stuff during sermon preparation are our high school and college students. Those are the ones that I have uppermost in my mind, reminding anytime in our printed liturgy where we'll have a creed or a portion of a confession of faith, I always make sure the dates are on there so that, because I'm thinking about our high school students and our college students, so that they can see a date, 325, and understanding that what we're doing here in the Shenandoah Valley is rooted in really, really ancient things. We haven't reinvented anything here.
Yeah. Life is so different now from previous centuries, and yet it's so similar. We're reading Gregory the Great's pastoral rule with our residents. And what is he saying? Pastors, don't be lazy. Devote yourself to prayer. Present the word to the people. I think of Dominic in the 12th century. He's leaving Spain. He enters into France. The Albigensians are just eating up the church. And he looks around and says, what can we do to protect ourselves from this? And he notices that the preaching of his day is just lousy. So he devotes himself to educating preachers. And that's what the Dominicans are, the order of preachers. And so it's just fascinating to see how different are our times, and yet on a fundamental level, so very similar.
Yeah.
So, I mean, here's the sort of the hot potato, or one of the hot potato questions, Chris. So how should conservative Protestants like ourselves, confessional Protestants, how should we think about the Roman Catholic Church as an institution? And how should we think about individual Roman Catholics as individual Christians?
Yeah. So often we go to one extreme or the other. We're either, foaming at the mouth, pit bulls, going for the jugular of the Catholic person with whom we disagree, or we're so open-minded that our brains fall out of our heads and we don't have any doctrinal integrity. I think the reformers themselves are an example for us here. So look at Luther, look at Calvin, look at Francis Turretin, Jerome Zanchi. I mean, right through so many figures, we're honest about our differences with regard to authority and justification and so many issues. And yet they recognize the Church of Rome as belonging to the Christian tradition. It wasn't in the same category as a cult. It had the Bible and Christian thought at the center. Now, tragically, that core is surrounded by a dense layer of tradition, which clouds and confuses the teaching of the gospel. We have to be honest about that. But we're talking about a tradition that belongs to Christianity. And so I think that gives us the opportunity to recognize valid Christian faith at work there in this particular Catholic or in this Catholic parish, and that is what sets it apart from religious traditions that we would consider categorically unchristian.
Yeah, that reminds me when I taught at seminary for many years. I remember students once asked me that one of my colleagues had, declared Rome was not a church at all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked the student, well, you need to ask that professor if he accepts Roman baptism, which I believe this professor did. And I said, well, I can't speak for the professor, but it strikes me as odd that you would deny that Rome is a true church in any shape or form, but would still accept Roman baptism. Now, for a Baptist, of course, Baptist is going to say it's not even a Baptist issue, but for a Presbyterian, that's a pretty pressing issue. in many ways. And I think, we would not accept Mormon baptism, but
Right.
we generally accept Roman. No, it's not. Thornwell and Hodge in the 19th century disagree on that issue. So it's not an entirely unified tradition. But I would say the majority tradition in the Presbyterian world has been the acceptance of Roman baptism. And that, I think, points towards what you described there, Chris, that there is, there's a lot of extraneous stuff in Rome that obscures the central core. But we accept Roman baptism. Mm-hmm. That has to have theological implications.
Yeah. And what is our objective when we speak with a Catholic friend or loved one? I want to evangelize that person. Now, someone would take umbrage with that and say, whoa, are you putting that person in a category that is unchristian? Well, no. To say that we evangelize people is a statement about who we are in Christ, right? Jesus is the light of the world. Wherever he went, the kingdom advanced. And he says, you will be my witnesses. It's ontological. It strikes at the heart of who we are. So every morning when we wake up and we have that first morning cup of coffee, we need to evangelize ourselves in a sense. We need to preach the gospel to ourselves. Mm-hmm. And on Sunday morning when we gather with God's people, we're hopefully encouraging one another in the gospel. That's the way I see my Catholic friends. I want to help them be drawn closer to the person of Jesus. And in that way, it simplifies our mission to embody and communicate this good news that results in that person as well as myself realizing a deeper union with Christ.
So you evangelize Protestants as well.
That's right. That's right. Let's be honest about it, and help one another have the gospel at the leading edge of who we are and what we do.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And I would encourage our listeners to, if you get a chance, read Chris's recent article on the very question that Carl raises. I found it to be very helpful in addressing this issue. Is the Church of Rome a Christian church? And I think he answers it very helpfully. And I think, Chris, your point about when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, when we meet, whether it's someone who is a Protestant churchgoer or identifies as an evangelical, or a Christian, which is a lot of people, or a Catholic, if we don't know them well enough to be able to have to know that they have a good, credible profession of faith in Christ, then the question just really comes down to: does this person know Jesus, and how can I help them know Christ? And I understand there's big questions, and it's worth saying when you're talking to a Catholic friend, it's worth hoping to discern where their faith is, and those are important. They're historical questions, but when it comes down to it, if you're talking to a Protestant, there's a real good chance that they might be a member of a church somewhere but haven't attended in 3 years. And so we have to be careful when we're asking some of those questions, lest we forget the problems in our own house.
It's well said.
Yeah. Well, our guest has been Chris Castaldo, and the book. I found the book just to be so helpful, and it came at a time when I was having conversations with two members of my church who had good friends who were really wrestling about converting to Rome. And when it arrived in the mail, I thought, I hadn't even been expecting it, and I got it immediately to them. And I would just encourage our folks to get a hold of this. It's called Why Do Protestants Convert? It is readable. It's accessible. It's a brief book, and I believe you'll find it to be very helpful in helping you navigate conversations with friends or family who are wrestling with this. It will at least give you some helpful categories so that you can helpfully come to a place of understanding what's kind of driving the gaze that they're casting across the Tiber to Rome. If you'd like to get a copy, you can go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and register to win a free copy. If not, you can find it any place where you typically get books. But if you'd go to mortificationofspin.org, you can enter to win a copy of Why Do Protestants Convert? And I think you'll be really helped by this a lot. And maybe you're a Catholic who's thinking about converting to Protestantism, in which case we would say, come on over. Carl, how many Catholic listeners do we have?
I have no idea.
Maybe, hey, how about this? If Tom Wine-Andy is listening, we've been nice enough to have him on as a guest. Maybe we could get him to read something.
I'd love to have Tom Wine-Andy over. I mean, I was at a conference with him last year, and I commented from the platform that I thought that he'd been the most important evangelical theologian on the doctrine of God in the last 20 years. I don't think he quite realized, but I think his stuff is read by a lot of Protestants because. Well,
I told him the very first time we had him on, I told him that he's one of the reasons I'm a Calvinist, because I read his book on impassibility, Does God Suffer?
Yeah.
And that drove me to reading the Reformers. And the church fathers on that doctrine. That's one of the reasons I became a Calvinist. I don't know if he was relieved by that or not, but he was kind.
Anyway, we love Father Tom.
That's right. Chris, thanks so much for coming on with us. Really appreciate your work in this area.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll look forward to being with you next time.
It's gonna have to be a different man. Time may change me.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.